In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe flew with an arrogance born of victory. Its pilots believed themselves masters of the sky. Its aircraft seemed unmatched, and its commanders spoke confidently of total control. Yet by 1943, the illusion had shattered. Allied factories poured out bombers and fighters in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to match. Cities were pounded daily, rail lines torn apart, oil depots set ablaze. The men who once soared over France or the Soviet Union with certainty now fought for survival, watching comrades fall in flames while the skies filled with swarms of enemy machines. Amid this grim reality, whispers began to circulate of a weapon that could restore dominance. A weapon so advanced it seemed to belong to another century. The name passed quietly at first. Messerschmitt 262, a jet fighter powered not by pistons but by turbines, promising speeds that would leave even the vaunted Mustang helpless. The project had roots before the war, when engineers with vision dared to imagine propulsion free of the heavy drag of propellers. Their prototypes were clumsy and fragile, engines that roared one moment and exploded the next. Test pilots approached them with caution, for each flight risked fire, collapse, or sudden silence. But the speeds glimpsed during those dangerous trials were astonishing. Where a Bf-109 strained across 400 miles per hour, the jet hinted at 600 perhaps. More, in an era where every mile of speed meant life or death. Such numbers were intoxicating. Engineers believed they had touched the future, though few imagined that the future would be demanded so desperately, so soon. By 1943, desperation had become obsession. Bombers flew with impunity over the Reich, escorted by Mustangs that carved apart defending fighters. Factories turned out aircraft, but losses consumed them faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe cried out for salvation, and politicians seized upon the jet as miracle. Orders came down to accelerate development at all costs. Hidden workshops worked day and night, engineers bending under impossible deadlines, laborers, many forced against their will, riveting wings and fitting turbines in underground halls while the earth shook from Allied bombs. Each Me-262 that rolled out of assembly carried not only promise, but also the weight of desperation, a burden heavier than its engines. Test pilots described their first experiences with awe. The acceleration was like nothing they had known, smooth and unrelenting, pushing them back into their seats until their breath caught. Enemy fighters of imagination seemed frozen, incapable of catching the silver shape. In those moments, the pilots felt invincible, but the exhilaration was tempered by danger. The turbines were fragile, their blades warping from heat, their bearings failing without warning. Many flights ended in emergency landings or in columns of smoke rising from forests where prototypes had crashed. Engineers patched, redesigned, improvised, but the truth could not be concealed. The jet was brilliant but unreliable. Still, the Reich demanded miracles, and miracles are not built on caution. Hitler himself intervened. Captivated by visions of vengeance against Allied cities, he demanded the jet be built as a bomber, capable of carrying explosives against London and beyond. Engineers protested fiercely. The Me-262, they argued, was meant to be an interceptor, fast and deadly in the skies, not weighed down by bombs. But their protests met with fury. Months were wasted adapting the design to a role it was never meant to fill. Only later, as Allied bombers grew ever bolder, was the aircraft returned to its intended mission. By then, time had slipped away, time the Luftwaffe could never regain. When the first Me-262S entered combat in 1944, the effect was electric. Allied bomber crews reported attacks faster than they could comprehend, shapes flashing past, cannon fire tearing through wings and engines before defensive gunners could even adjust their sights. Entire aircraft fell in flames, survivors watching in horror as comrades disintegrated around them. Escorting fighters tried to give chase, but found themselves left far behind, straining in vain against a foe that treated their best efforts as nothing. Reports spread quickly. The Germans had jets. Panic rippled through units, tempered only by the recognition that the sightings were rare, the attacks brief. Still, the impression was indelible. For the first time in years, Allied airmen felt hunted. Yet inside Germany, the frustration was immense. Pilots clamored for more machines. Commanders demanded mass deployment. But reality intervened. Engines burned out after mere hours of use. Fuel supplies dwindled to nothing. Airfields were under constant bombardment. Runways cratered, hangars shattered. Many jets never flew at all, destroyed on the ground before they had a chance to prove themselves. The miracle weapon existed, but could not be wielded in numbers that mattered. Each successful sortie was balanced by accidents, shortages, and losses to Allied attacks on bases. For every bomber that fell in flames, dozens more rained destruction upon German cities unopposed. The Me-262 was dazzling, but brilliance alone could not replace factories, oil, or time. By late summer of 1944, the jet was no longer rumor, but reality. Allied formations reported losses inflicted by silver shapes that appeared with terrifying suddenness, struck with 4 cannon shells, and vanished before defenders could respond. In mess halls and debriefings, aircrews whispered about the strange roar unlike piston engines, a deeper thunder that seemed to vibrate in bone rather than ear. Some gunners swore they had fired directly into the path of the jets, only to see their tracers trail uselessly, outpaced by a machine that moved faster than thought. Pilots of escort fighters admitted that when they tried to give chase, their Mustangs felt like wagons straining against a ghost. Yet the jet was as fragile as it was fast. Dozens were lost not to combat, but to the betrayal of their own engines. Turbines seizing, bearings exploding, fire racing down nacelles. The marvel demanded sacrifice. And young men paid with their lives before they even saw the enemy. Inside the squadrons, tension ran high. Veterans of countless missions tried to adapt to a new way of fighting, learning that dogfights no longer existed in the familiar sense. The Me-262 could not twist and turn with propeller fighters, but did not need to. Combat became mathematics measured in seconds. Pilots approached bomber streams from astern, closed at immense speed, aimed with icy precision, and fired brief bursts before flashing away. Success meant bombers destroyed in fireballs, but a missed shot meant nothing, for by the time the trigger was released, the target was already behind. Pilots described the strange emptiness of such attacks, a duel without duel, a kill without contest. Some relished it, others missed the old contest of skill, but all understood that the rules of war had changed. Ground crews bore their own burdens. Engines were delicate creatures, demanding endless hours of work for a handful of minutes in the air. Crews scavenged constantly, stripping wrecks to feed survivors, improvising tools from scrap, working under floodlights that cast long shadows across ruined hangars. Allied bombs fell often, sending men scrambling into shelters, then back to the wreckage to salvage what they could. They lived in exhaustion. Yet pride pushed them forward, each successful sortie felt like victory not only for the pilot but for every mechanic who had coaxed life from the stubborn turbines. But pride turned to bitterness when raids destroyed entire squadrons on the ground, jets burning in neat rows before they ever lifted off. The miracle machine was powerful in the air, but helpless against bombs that fell unchallenged. Allied intelligence quickly realized that the key to defeating the jet was not in the sky, but on the ground. Reconnaissance flights mapped airfields where Me-262s gathered. Bombers were dispatched to crater runways, and fighters patrolled nearby skies like vultures. Mustangs developed a cruel reputation for waiting at altitude until jets returned from missions, as the German pilots throttled back, lowered landing gear, and bled away speed. The predators swooped. Many Me-262s fell within sight of their own bases, their wreckage smoldering at runway edges. Their pilots killed moments from safety. Survivors remembered these landings as the most terrifying part of every mission. In the air, they were hunters, faster than all foes, but on approach, they were prey, helpless to defend themselves. The contradiction gnawed at morale. Letters written by pilots spoke of pride in flying the most advanced fighter in the world, but also of dread, of exhaustion, of hopelessness. They confessed to comrades that each mission felt like gambling with fate, that their victories were dust compared to the endless streams of bombers that still leveled German cities daily. Some clung to belief that mass deployment could turn the tide, that if only fuel and parts were available, the Me-262 would sweep the skies clean. Others saw through the illusion, recognizing that no machine could reverse the collapse of armies on every front. Their words echo with tragedy, the voices of men who flew into the future but could not escape the present. Civilians, meanwhile, were fed endless propaganda. Posters showed the jets soaring above ruins with slogans promising vengeance. Newspapers proclaimed victories that hinted at salvation. Radio broadcasts declared that miracle weapons were arriving that would change everything. Families huddled in shelters listened and hoped, but when they emerged, the rubble around them told another story. The bombs still fell, the hunger still grew, the armies still retreated. For them, the Me-262 became a cruel symbol, proof of what German ingenuity could achieve, yet also proof that brilliance meant nothing against overwhelming numbers. They looked skyward at the roar of jets, cheered perhaps for a moment, then turned back to shattered homes. By autumn of 1944, entire jet wings were ordered into desperate battles. Some managed impressive kills, carving through bomber streams, leaving American crews shaken. Yet the cost was unsustainable. Engines burned out faster than factories could replace them. Every loss on the ground hurt more than a dozen victories in the sky. Allied dominance of fuel supplies tightened until sorties became rare. Pilots sat idle, pacing like caged predators beside aircraft that gleamed uselessly under camouflage nets. They dreamed of flight, but reality chained them to silence. The Reich had built the fastest machine in the world, but lacked the means to use it, and that irony became unbearable for those closest to it. Winter came harsh and merciless, snow and ice covering runways already torn by bombs, mechanics laboring with numb hands to coax fragile turbines into life. The Me-262 squadrons faced not only the enemy, but also the cold. Engines reluctant to start, lubricants thickening, fuel supplies dwindling further. Pilots described sitting in cockpits, shivering beneath flight suits, waiting for clearance while Allied fighters prowled unseen above the clouds. Each mission began with tension so sharp it felt like pain. Every throttle push a prayer that the turbines would not stall or explode, yet still they flew, for orders demanded it, and pride demanded it too. Combat in winter skies carried an otherworldly quality. Contrails etched stark white lines across blue heavens, bomber streams glinting like silver rivers under pale sunlight. Into these formations the jets dived like predators, closing at unimaginable speed, cannons spitting death in fractions of a second. Entire bombers disintegrated, crews lost without warning, survivors staring in horror as comrades vanished in fire. The Allies adapted quickly, but even with new tactics they could not deny the shock of those moments. Reports speak of nervous gunners firing at shadows, of pilots gripping controls tighter, of escorts forced to remain closer to bombers lest the jets slip through. The Me-262 had become a specter that haunted every mission, a reminder that victory could still carry sudden cost. Yet the brilliance was always shadowed by futility. For every bomber destroyed, dozens reached their targets, and German cities continued to burn. Factories producing the jets themselves were bombed into rubble, workers killed. Assembly lines shattered, engineers scrambled to rebuild underground, carving workshops from caves and tunnels, but output slowed to a trickle. Every new machine was precious, yet many were lost to accidents before they tasted combat. Pilots wrote bitterly of comrades killed by engine failure, by collapsed landing gear, by fuel lines frozen in the cold. They flew marvels that demanded perfection from men exhausted by war. And perfection was scarce. Inside the squadrons, tension grew between veterans and novices. Aces with dozens of kills carried themselves with confidence. But the influx of barely trained boys unsettled them. Some of these young pilots had flown only a few hours before being thrown into jets they could barely control. They were slaughtered mercilessly, torn apart in the sky, or smashed against frozen runways. Veterans mourned them, but also resented the waste, knowing that each lost aircraft meant fewer chances for experienced men to fight effectively. Commanders pushed for discipline, for courage, for sacrifice, but discipline could not replace training, and courage could not repair engines. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and the jets were bleeding with it. Allied strategy pressed harder. Mustang squadrons lingered constantly near known bases, ambushing jets during takeoff or landing. Some pilots admitted these missions felt like hunting rather than fighting, swooping on enemies who could not defend themselves. But the war had no room for mercy. They struck again and again, filling airfields with wreckage, denying the jets the chance to dominate. Bomber raids targeted fuel plants relentlessly until reserves dwindled to nothing. Mechanics resorted to mixing inferior fuels, risking further engine damage. But orders left no alternative. Pilots climbed into cockpits knowing that every mission carried not only enemy fire, but betrayal from their own machines. Among civilians, the image of the jet persisted in propaganda. Films showed them streaking triumphantly through skies, announcers proclaiming that Germany still held the edge, that miracle weapons would reverse the tide. Children cheered in cinemas. Women nodded grimly with forced hope. Old men muttered that perhaps salvation was still possible, but the rumble of Allied bombers overhead told another story. Shaking windows, sending families into shelters, collapsing buildings onto the very posters that proclaimed victory. The contrast was brutal. Miracle in words, ruin in reality. The Me-262 became not salvation, but symbol of contradiction, an icon of pride that could not shield against despair. For the pilots themselves, winter brought exhaustion deeper than cold. They fought with courage, they admired their machines, but they also knew the truth. Diaries speak of resignation, of men acknowledging that they were flying into inevitability. Some continued for honor, determined to resist until the end. Others admitted to numbness, to a sense that they were already ghosts climbing into cockpits each dawn. They loved the sensation of speed, the roar of turbines, the brief power of outpacing every enemy, but they despised the futility of fighting with weapons too few, too fragile, too late. Their war had become a paradox, and they lived inside it every day. By spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing on every front. Armies retreating, cities reduced to rubble, civilians starving. Yet still the Me-262 took to the skies. Allied crews crossing Germany described seeing flashes of silver erupt from cloud banks. Jets diving into bomber streams with devastating effect. Cannon fire, shattering wings, explosions lighting the daylight sky. For a moment, the illusion of German air power returned. But it was only illusion. Each sortie was rare, each success fleeting, and behind every kill lay shortages so deep that commanders wondered whether the machines would ever fly again. Fuel was nearly gone, production scattered, airfields under constant attack. The fastest aircraft in the world sat idle more often than it flew, its turbines cold while Allied formations rained destruction unopposed. Pilots grew haunted by the paradox. In the air, they felt invincible, untouchable, masters of a new age of combat. On the ground, they were hunted, crouching in shelters while bombs churned runways. Watching comrades killed before engines could even start, takeoffs became gambles against fate, landings moments of sheer terror as Mustangs waited above, diving upon slowing jets like hawks striking pigeons. Many Me-262s were lost within sight of safety, their wreckage burning at runway edges, their pilots' bodies carried away beneath black smoke. Survivors spoke bitterly of these moments, admitting that they feared landing more than battle, that every descent felt like surrender to inevitability. In desperation, commanders ordered missions not only against bombers, but against advancing ground forces. Jets swooped upon columns of tanks, fired rockets, strafed convoys. They inflicted damage, but their numbers were too few to alter campaigns measured in armies and nations. Allied troops reported awe at the speed of these machines, soldiers staring upward as silver arrows slashed overhead. But I gave way to determination. Anti-aircraft guns filled the skies with fire. Fighters pounced at every opportunity, and the jets that survived were forced back to airfields already in ruins. Every mission became sacrifice without consequence, blood spent without return. Within the squadron's morale frayed. Some pilots clung to honor, vowing to fight until the last machine was gone, believing that courage still mattered even when victory was impossible. Others sank into despair, writing in diaries that they felt like test subjects sent to die for technology that would serve only the future, not their present. Young recruits were pushed into cockpits with minimal training, many killed on first flights. Their names forgotten even as engineers and officers demanded more sacrifices. Veterans grew bitter, knowing that experience could not outweigh numbers, that brilliance could not undo collapse. They loved their aircraft, admired its beauty, but they hated the futility of flying it in a war already lost. Allied pilots, meanwhile, refined their methods. They no longer chased the jet in level flight. They hunted its lifelines. Fuel depots were bombed mercilessly, runways cratered, maintenance hangars obliterated. They struck airfields until nothing remained but smoking wreckage, confident that by strangling support they could render the jet irrelevant. And they were correct. By April, sorties had become rare, each fueled by desperation more than strategy. Jets launched in pairs, sometimes alone, harassing bombers but unable to sustain pressure. The miracle weapon had become a ghost, haunting skies briefly before vanishing into silence. In Berlin, propaganda still spoke of salvation. Hitler raged for mass attacks, declaring that hundreds of jets would sweep the enemy from the skies. His words carried no connection to reality. Commanders knew they could barely muster dozens. Engineers knew factories were destroyed. Mechanics knew there was no fuel. Yet orders continued. And so pilots flew, some from loyalty, others from inertia, all from circumstances that allowed no escape. Each mission was both defiance and tragedy. A gesture that proved Germany could still strike even as the nation collapsed into ruin. Civilians looked upward one last time, hearing the strange roar, pointing at shapes that seemed to belong to another century. For a heartbeat, hope flickered again, but bombs still fell, streets still burned, armies still retreated. The miracle was beautiful, but beauty cannot alter destiny. The Me-262 flew into the final weeks of the war as a predator without prey, a marvel without purpose, a blade sharpened too late to matter. When Germany surrendered in May, wrecked jets lay scattered across airfields, some intact but unfueled, others gutted by fire, still others half-assembled in underground factories that now echoed with silence. Pilots surrendered or fled, engineers hid or were captured, and the machines themselves became trophies of victors who studied them eagerly. The war was lost, and the miracle weapon had died with it. The final months of the Reich turned every flight into an act of defiance. Pilots who climbed into the cockpits of Me-262s knew they were taking off not to win a war, but to prolong resistance for a few more hours. Perhaps to remind the enemy that Germany still had claws even as its body collapsed. They wrote in letters never sent that they felt like ghosts flying for a country already dead, shadows streaking across skies filled with fire. Some admitted that they no longer believe in orders or speeches, that they flew only for comrades, for the thrill of speed, or because there was no other choice. Each sortie began with the same ritual. Mechanics coaxing fragile turbines into life, ground crews scattering as bombs exploded nearby, pilots tightening harnesses and whispering silent farewells before pushing throttles forward into uncertainty. Combat in those last days often blurred into chaos. Allied bombers numbered in the hundreds, escorted by fighters in equal measure, filling the air with metal and smoke. The jets could slice into these formations, inflict terror, and even score kills. But the sky was so crowded with enemies that escape was uncertain. Some pilots described closing on bombers with cannon fire blazing, seeing explosions blossom, and then watching their instruments flicker as fuel ran out or engines failed. They bailed out into cold air, parachutes opening above burning fields, prisoners before they touched the ground. Others never returned, their wrecks marked by columns of black smoke rising over villages already shattered by artillery. On the ground, the atmosphere was one of desperation without illusion. Airfields were pounded daily, craters gouging runways, wrecked machines pushed aside by bulldozers that no longer had fuel to run properly. Mechanics scavenged in near darkness, stripping usable parts from burned-out fuselages. They knew every effort was temporary, every repaired engine doomed to fail soon. Yet they worked with grim determination. As if labor itself was a form of defiance, Allied fighters swooped overhead. Almost at will, strafing workshops, killing crews in open air, survivors crawled from rubble and returned to work because nothing else remained. In diaries later found, some wrote that they felt less like soldiers and more like mourners, maintaining corpses of machines that could not be saved. Commanders continued to demand miracles. Orders arrived from Berlin insisting that jets attack bridges, tanks, columns of troops. Pilots shook their heads but obeyed, diving upon armored lines, firing rockets, banking away under storms of flak. Some missions succeeded, tanks destroyed, convoys scattered. Others ended with jets torn apart by fire, their remains smoldering beside the very roads they were sent to attack. The imbalance was absurd. A handful of machines hurled against armies, yet still they flew. Pride compelled them. Loyalty compelled them. The momentum of war compelled them. The Me-262 was too advanced to ignore, too symbolic to leave idle, even when logic said it changed nothing. Among the pilots themselves, divisions sharpened. Aces who had built reputations in earlier years flew with grim professionalism, determined to score victories until the last day. Younger men, scarcely trained, trembled in cockpits they barely understood. Many killed before firing a shot. Some veterans resented their presence, calling them wasted lives, yet others tried to teach, to guide, to pass on skills even in the shadow of defeat. Camaraderie mixed with bitterness, courage with fatalism. In conversations overheard by mechanics, men joked about death with hollow laughter, then fell silent when engines roared and comrades disappeared into the sky, never to return. Civilians living near airfields saw both sides of the jet's story. They marveled at its speed, pointing upward as it streaked above, but they also wept when Allied raids turned runways into infernos. Children scavenged metal from wreckage while their parents buried neighbors killed in bombings. Propaganda continued to proclaim the jet as miracle, but those who lived beneath its shadow knew better. They saw miracle machines sitting motionless for lack of fuel. They saw corpses of pilots carried back on stretchers. They saw Allied aircraft ruling the skies regardless of German marvels. For them, the Me-262 was a paradox they could not celebrate, a symbol of brilliance wasted in ruin. As April deepened and Soviet artillery thundered ever closer, the jets still flew, rising from cratered runways into skies filled with enemies. Some pilots fought with desperation bordering on madness, throwing themselves at bomber formations even when outnumbered hopelessly. Others sought only survival, firing brief bursts before vanishing, conserving every drop of fuel to return home. The contrast revealed the fractured spirit of the Luftwaffe, defiance and despair coexisting, courage and resignation woven together. The Me-262 embodied that fracture, a marvel of design chained to a cause already broken. The final weeks of the Reich turned every jet sortie into a requiem. Pilots who strapped into cockpits no longer spoke of victory, only of endurance, of proving that they could still strike even as everything collapsed around them. Some wrote that they felt like shadows streaking through skies already claimed by the enemy. Their missions gestures of defiance more than strategies. The Me-262 still terrified those it met in combat, shredding bombers in seconds, leaving escort fighters powerless to catch it, but such triumphs were fragments against the avalanche of Allied power. Every destroyed bomber was replaced within days, every loss swallowed by the sheer weight of American industry. The jet remained brilliant, but brilliance could not overcome inevitability. At airfields, chaos reigned. Runways cratered daily, workshops reduced to rubble, fuel drums empty. Engines scavenged from wrecks and fitted desperately into survivors. Mechanics worked with bleeding hands, shells exploding around them, clinging to duty long after hope was gone. They whispered that they were not repairing aircraft anymore, but preparing sacrifices, offering machines to a war god that demanded lives with no return. Each takeoff felt like a funeral, the roar of turbines a dirge. Ground crews saluted departing pilots with eyes already wet, uncertain whether they would ever see them again. Many times they did not. Inside cockpits, the tension was unbearable. Pilots pushed throttles forward knowing that their aircraft might betray them before reaching altitude. They watched instruments with the intensity of men staring at fate, praying for stability, bracing for fire. Those who reached combat felt the strange duality of power and futility. They could still annihilate enemies, still carve destruction into bomber streams. Yet even as bombers fell, they glimpsed endless ranks stretching to the horizon. Replacements waiting, escorts swarming, victories tasted of ashes, for nothing changed, nothing was saved, the Reich continued to burn beneath them. Allied pilots grew almost casual in their hunts, circling near airfields with patience, waiting for jets to descend. They spoke later with respect for the machine, admiration for its speed and firepower, but they also admitted the cruelty of their ambushes. Many Me-262s fell in those moments. Flamed-out turbines unable to provide escape, gear extended, speed bled away. Survivors described the terror of final approaches, the helplessness of seeing contrails die from above, the explosion of gunfire tearing wings apart while the ground rose swiftly. More than one veteran confessed that he feared landing more than battle, that every return felt like submitting to execution. Civilians still clung to rumors. Word spread that squadrons of jets would soon sweep the skies clear, that miracle weapons waited to be unleashed. People emerged from shelters to glimpse silver shapes overhead, cheering, believing for a heartbeat that salvation had come. But the cheers faded as bombs continued to fall, as food grew scarcer, as armies surrendered. The jet was real, its brilliance undeniable. But it could not alter destiny. To many, it became a cruel emblem of what might have been, proof that genius had arrived too late. Children remembered the roar, elders remembered the promises, but none could forget the rubble that surrounded them. By late April, the Soviets closed upon Berlin, and the jets still flew. Some missions struck tank columns, others strafed bridges, a few still attacked bombers, but all were fragments of resistance, gestures rather than campaigns. Pilots knew it. Commanders knew it. Even enemies knew it. The Me-262 had entered history not as savior, but as symbol, a machine that revealed the future in the midst of collapse. Its final flights were described by survivors as both beautiful and tragic. Silver arrows streaking through ruined skies, roaring defiantly into battles already lost. When surrender came in May, many jets lay abandoned, their sleek bodies silent on cratered airfields. Some were intact, but unfueled. Others burned too. Skeletons, still others half-assembled in underground halls seized by advancing troops. Pilots vanished into captivity, engineers into interrogation, and the aircraft into legend. The story of the Me-262 during the war is thus the story of contradiction itself. It was unstoppable yet defeated, brilliant yet futile. A glimpse of tomorrow chained to the ruin of today. It terrified enemies, but could not protect friends. It proved that imagination could leap ahead, even when circumstances dragged everything backward. Those who flew it remembered awe and sorrow in equal measure. Those who fought against it remembered fear and relief. Those who watched from below remembered pride and despair. The Me-262 was never simply a machine. It was a mirror reflecting the desperation, the genius, and the futility of its time. In its final flights across the burning skies of 1945, it carried not only cannons and rockets, but also the last fragments of a dying nation's hope, disappearing into history as both predator and ghost, as miracle and tragedy, as the aircraft that revealed the future yet could not save the present.